as Anna said, I'm going to talk to you all today about some research that has been going on for a few years now and will continue. So I am showing you some sort of preliminary findings. That in mind, I'm going to be talking to you about harmful narratives about individuals who identify as BIPOC in nature and really getting at some of the barriers that keep our environmental workforce from being the diverse, vibrant workforce that many are calling for. Before I get into that, I just want to go through this note about language. And I'll say I personally, and this entire research team that has worked on this project for the last few years, is really deeply committed to equity, and we're seeking actively to address inequity in our work. And we think it's our collective responsibility as scientists and natural resource professionals to be doing that, you know, in our research, in our teaching, around our dinner table. And so this is really the center of this research is really about addressing equity and inequity. And really that's something that I and my co-investigators are very committed to personally. I'm going to use the words race and gender in this presentation, and I'm going to talk about what we might think of as racial categories or gender categories. And before I do that, I do want to acknowledge that those are both socially constructed ideas, and neither of them are rooted in biology. And if we look back through time, we can see that not only are they not rooted in biology, but they're constantly in flux, right? They're sort of fluid buckets that we put people in that are not based in genetics or in biology and that change over time. I'm going to use them to talk about dismantling racism and misogyny. But I will note that I am increasingly uncomfortable with putting people into the very buckets that have been used historically to oppress groups of people. And if anybody is interested in having a conversation about that, either during the Q&A or offline later, I'm constantly, and my whole research team is constantly trying to find better language and evolved language to talk about these issues. So I'm going to use the acronym BIPOC. It stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. It is a critiqued term, it is an imperfect term, and it is also probably the most widely used vernacular of the day. And so that's why I'm using it. So if you're watching this webinar after the fact, know that at the moment that I gave this webinar, it was the terminology that felt most appropriate, and it will probably almost certainly evolve over time. So having said that, I want to make sure I've alluded to the fact that the whole research team is committed to doing work that addresses equity, and that team up until this point has included Dr. Leon Walls, who's faculty here in education at UVM and has been deeply committed to equity and justice in education systems. Jillian Cara, who really this is her master's work that I'm presenting today. She graduated from SUNY Plattsburgh last May. Nate Trachty, who formerly of SUNY Plattsburgh and the Watershed Alliance, Ashley Eaton of UVM and the Watershed Alliance, and the folks with Upward Bound at both SUNY Plattsburgh and UVM, who have been key partners in doing this work, and then additionally colleagues at UConn that I will mention when I talk about where this is all going in the future. So just a note that this is far from my own sole efforts here. The whole team of great people has been working on this. And a note also that I'm going to describe some high school classes as part of this work that did some watershed education work over the summer, quite a bit of watershed education work over the last few summers. And this image that you're seeing right now was created by one of those classes, an art class, in which watershed science was integrated into the art class. And then they created this very cool tile mural, and you're seeing their work, their depiction of what's going on in Lake Champlain and then along its shorelines. So maybe some, surprising class to integrate watershed science into, or maybe not. Pretty cool though. Okay, so by way of background, many of you may, be aware already that the environmental workforce broadly, the environmental movement broadly, has remained pretty homogenous despite increasing calls to diversify. And those calls to diversify have, had many motivations behind them. People have argued it is morally just to open the workforce up and make it welcoming to a broader range of people. Of course, that's true. Others have had more pragmatic calls that we need a diverse body of perspectives to address pressing issues like climate change and deforestation and other sort of emerging environmental challenges of our day. And although those calls to diversify have become ubiquitous, the environmental movement, particularly as seen in degree programs and the workforce largely, has remained pretty homogenous, largely white. And so, these studies are a few years old, but we can see recent studies that these trends persist, that environmental degree programs at the university level often will serve a lower percentage of students who identify as BIPOC than, that same university as a whole. So for example, across the lake at SUNY Plattsburgh, where I previously was faculty, the percentage of students who identify as BIPOC is somewhere around 30%, but within the Center for Earth and Environmental Science, it was much lower, closer to 14 or 15% at the last time we looked at the numbers. And that trend is reflected, that's not a Plattsburgh issue, that trend is reflected across the country. And unsurprisingly, it continues into the workforce. So the environmental workforce is still largely white, and study after study has demonstrated that this is the case, and that sort of as you go up the chain in terms of promotion and responsibility within environmental organizations, individuals who identify as BIPOC are less likely to hold leadership positions, are less likely to persist in jobs with the same sort of retention rates as their peers who identify as white. And so this really demonstrates a clear need to attract, support, and retain people from diverse backgrounds within the environmental workforce for both moral and pragmatic reasons, right? Those reasons that I said before of it is morally just to do that work, and also we need perspectives, the best minds, and diverse perspectives to solve the pressing environmental issues of our day. So a lot of scholars have sought to understand why these trends that I'm talking about have persisted despite a lot of efforts, to diversify, especially on the part of individual organizations. So we can think about organizations like the Nature Conservancy or Audubon that have had really explicit initiatives. So a lot of scholars have said, despite that, how come these trends persist? And some people have suggested that individuals who identify as BIPOC are disconnected from nature. So there is a whole range of scholarship that looks at connection to nature, and that has, demonstrated through empirical studies that people who identify as BIPOC demonstrate less connection to nature than their white peers. And the logic here, of course, is that if you are not as connected, then perhaps you don't feel a desire to go into that workforce to work on issues of stewardship, to have a career in that field, and that instead you're going to choose something else that you feel deeply connected to and pursue a career in that. Other scholars have disagreed with this assessment. So scholars like Dorceta Taylor and Carolyn Finney have noted that this is just really not historically accurate, that, for example, natural areas are central to Black Americans' heritage. So both scholars have talked about how important forests were as places of healing for enslaved people, how critical natural areas were for people to to forage, to find traditional medicines, and how when people of color were actively excluded from the national park system, many BIPOC communities created their own alternatives so that they could continue to recreate outside. So lots of evidence that this story of disconnectedness is at least incomplete, right? And it's not that it is, necessarily completely false. There are also many stories and accounts and scholarly works about people who identify as BIPOC feeling disconnected from places. Carolyn Finney also talks about in her book how, because people of color were disallowed in the national parks, it was very difficult for them to build connection to that land, right? But that this single narrative of disconnection explaining a lack of diversity in degree programs and the workforce is incomplete, and also that it's harmful because it allows us to not really look at all of the range of factors that might be going on or are going on that create barriers or disincentivize people who identify as BIPOC from considering or pursuing these degree programs and careers. And so we really wanted to look at the connection between identity, career aspiration, and connection to nature and stewardship within a population of individuals who's actively considering what they're going to do in college and what they might be going into. So that was really the goal of this work, exploring connection between identity, career aspiration, connection to nature, and environmental stewardship. To do this, we wanted to, as I said, look at a population of students who is actively thinking about college, what they're going to major in, and what they want to do for a career. And we decided to partner with Upward Bound, which is a college readiness program that exists nationally. It's funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and it targets students who are from low to moderate income backgrounds, or whose neither parent has a bachelor's degree. So the majority of students are indeed first-generation college students. Many universities, especially state universities across the country, have Upward Bound programs. Both UVM and SUNY Plattsburgh have one, and they run summer classes to introduce these high school students to the idea of a university, how universities work, the range of options that are available to them, and sort of the course of study that they might explore when they eventually arrive at college. So this was a nice population for us to work with because these students are sort of primed and thinking about what they might study and what they might pursue when they arrive at university. We created a short survey tool that we wanted to administer to these students. And this actually took a tremendous amount of work because we wanted the survey tool to be very short so that Upward Bound could give it to their students during their advising sessions, but also we really wanted to minimize bias that was, baked into the survey questions. So I have the word eliminate up here. I should probably change that to minimize because it's probably impossible to ever completely eliminate bias. But we looked at pre-existing survey tools that measured the different elements that we wanted to look at. So connection to nature, stewardship, career aspirations. And we tried to really take out the questions that might preference one group of individuals over another. So if there was questions about specific ecological knowledge, we removed those questions because they might preference someone who had, already been taught a lot about that specific ecology. If there were questions about how much time students spent in wilderness areas, we also removed those because it would preference students coming from rural areas, right? A lot of the students on the New York side were coming from within Adirondack Park, whereas the students on the Vermont side, many of them live close to Burlington and Winooski. There would be some discrepancy in just how people spent time outside and where. And then we sort of, once we had those questions, whittled it down to a manageable survey for our Upward Bound staff to administer to 600 students before and after they engaged in activities focused on watershed science. So you saw that example of the art students learning about the ecology of the lake and then painting the ceramic mural. These were high school students, and we asked them to take the survey, and we asked them, we sent them follow-up reminders, or the Upward Bound staff sent them follow-up reminders. And so of course, not all of them took it, but we got a response rate of 42%. So 253 students have taken the surveys in the first few summers that we've done that. And those of you who are, survey researchers will note, that's an acceptable response rate. We are pretty happy with that. Of course, we would love it to be closer to a total census, but we'll take it. And then we created scales based on the questions that were measuring connectedness to nature, stewardship, and career aspirations. So we took, the chunk of questions that was measuring connectedness to nature, created one latent variable, one scale that included all of those questions, and the same for stewardship and career. And then that allowed us to regress those individual variables on the variables that we created for race and gender. So we also asked survey participants to fill out some demographic information. And we can see what correlates with what. So what factors are most closely linked with other factors. So one of the first things that we really wanted to know was this theory that connectedness leads to career aspiration. Is that even holding up for our population? Because if it's not, then we know that that's really not the powerful leverage point that we're hoping it will be to initiate change and create a more diverse workforce. When we looked at the connection, we did see that connectedness to nature is positively related to career aspiration. We see that stewardship is also positively related to career aspiration. And then that connectedness is positively related to stewardship. So this is, as we would expect, predicted in some pre-existing literature. And then we were further able to use a plugin for those of you who are SPSS users. There's a software that you can use called the process tool, which allows you to just look at if any of these variables are mediating any of the other ones. And we see that connectedness to nature is really positively impacting career aspirations directly, but also through stewardship. So what this tells us is that when students have connectedness to nature, they feel connected to nature, they feel a sense of stewardship towards it, and they want to consider pursuing those career aspirations. And I have the effect size down here for anybody who is interested in it, and I'm happy to talk more about these statistics and sort of why we chose to use the regression and the process tool if anyone is really interested about it. The important thing to note here is that within our population, yes, connectedness to nature did closely correlate with stewardship and career aspiration, and it seems like the pathway is connection builds stewardship and interest in a career. We then looked to see how that trend or how those relationships were different for different groups of students, and I'll say that we don't yet have a big enough sample size to run those same models within subgroups of demographic subgroups, nor do we yet have a big enough sample size to look at intersectionality of race and gender within the population. So just a reminder that these results are preliminary. We still have several more years of this, and we hope that that sample size will grow and that we will be able to look at intersectional identities as well as rerun those models for different demographic groups. At this point, we see no significant difference in connectedness to nature, stewardship, or environmental career aspirations across self-reported racial groups within the student that, that sample of 250 plus students that we have surveyed so far. This corroborates Dorcia Taylor's work that I talked about a little earlier, which has found that in her studies, none of the Black students that she has interviewed or surveyed report being somewhat disconnected or disconnected from nature, right? Really, this is demonstrating that students within this population are pretty similar in terms of how connected they feel and how much sense of stewardship they feel and in how much they're considering an environmental career. It also corroborates some recent work by folks at another SUNY school, which found no significant difference across self-identified racial groups in terms of outdoor career aspirations. So they were specifically looking at folks who might want to work in outdoor recreation or outdoor education, and race did not play a factor in career aspirations in those fields either. When we looked at gender, and I'll say that we allowed people to self-report here, and where I have non-conforming, I'll just note that people answered a whole range of self-reported gender identity, and then I consolidated it into non-conforming. So this is another place where I would love to talk about the most appropriate use of language. So we had some folks report non-binary here. We had folks reporting two-spirited here. And so for the sake of, being able to look at numbers in aggregate, I made the decision to consolidate that into gender non-conforming. But really it is it's a more diverse group of individuals reporting than was sort of demonstrated in this table. Having said that, respondents who self-identified as female or who identified as gender non-conforming did respond significantly higher on both the stewardship and the connectedness to nature scale, but did not report significantly differently in terms of the career aspiration scale. And so, what that tells us is that that deeper sense of connection, that deeper sense of stewardship, it didn't translate into environmental career aspirations. And on the whole, like if we look at all of these statistics together, what this is pointing us towards is that connection is important and stewardship is important. They do lead to environmental career aspirations, but they are not the whole story. There are a whole range of factors that are likely playing into what is encouraging people to consider environmental degree programs or environmental careers. And connection cannot be our only leverage point when we're thinking about how to diversify the environmental workforce. Environmental education programs likely need to do much more than fostering a sense of connection. I think that's what we're starting to see from this and other work. So our next steps, we haven't compared pre-post-test survey data. Partially that is because it has been pretty hard to get the post-test survey numbers as high as the pre-test survey numbers. So we'll hopefully be improving on that in future summers. We'll be continuing this project for 3 more summers with continued support from both Lake Champlain Sea Grant and going forward Connecticut Sea Grant. So colleagues Anita Morzio and Laura Cisneros at UConn will be replicating this summer and next summer in collaboration with the team that I talked about at the beginning. And we'll be including students from Connecticut Upward Bound as well as CONCAP, which is a similar program that's run out of UConn around college readiness with high school students from a very similar population, but which also allows dreamers to participate. So adding, another population of students from another state, adding to will increase the robust nature of these results, adding more, just a bigger data set, hopefully will allow us to look at some of those intersectional identities. And then we'll also be conducting follow-up interviews with students and natural resource professionals to really get at the idea that there's a whole range of factors that are, informing people's decisions around what they choose to major in college, and then ultimately if they choose to enter the environmental workforce, and then, what is required for them to be happy and successful and persist. So those interviews will begin next year, and hopefully will really help us to flesh out and describe the constellation of factors that are affecting these trends of how we see sort of a lack of diversity within the environmental workforce. We'll be recruiting a PhD student to work on a lot of that work. So there'll be one PhD student at UConn who UConn has already recruited, and then Dr. Walls and I are actively looking for somebody to start here at UVM in the fall. So please spread the word if there's somebody in this webinar that thinks they are really excited about this and they want to work on some of this data or help continue to collect and interview people, please reach out to me. And then I have, just a few citations that I mentioned. I'm happy to send this list and more out to folks who are interested. And then I will thank my collaborators and Sea Grant again for hosting this and for funding this important work. And I can, leave this up while we take questions in the chat. Yeah, I'm excited to read questions and hear any comments that people might have.